the best single first indication of overcropping is when the maturity of your grape is considerably delayed as compared to the average for the region in which you're growing them. And I pointed out that if you look at it in this way, for the season goes on, and the sugar somewhere down here begins to slowly rise on a normal crop vine. If you've got, this is normal load, and this is sugar. And if you have overcrop vines, you follow along like this, and then get up in here, and they begin to drag behind, and finally perhaps get out to that type of sugar, this being overcrop. Now, I didn't intend to go into a greatly detailed lecture on this because you get it in 105. I just wanted to use it for a moment to illustrate it. The acid, in the meantime, well, if you come back here where the berries have just begun to form, the acid goes up, and then it gradually drifts down. And I said that a given vine can only produce so much fruit and bring it to normal maturity. By normal maturity, we meant something here approaching dowling, say, of this degree dowling. By the way, we're going to do away with this word dowling because we argued this quite a bit on the new book. There's two terms for this percent sugar. There's degree Brix, which those of you who know anything about citrus know that that's a term they use, and we have the term degree dowling. And my big argument was, as I'm a former citrus man, what is the difference between these two? And it's just the difference of two men's names. So why not go along with the rest of the food industry and use Brix? So in the new text, everything is converted to Brix. It just means percent soluble solids. But since the solids, other than sugar, might amount to 0.5% or less, 0.5%. Why don't you yell instead of waving your arms? So we have this term then, just for the record, degree Brix, degree Bowling. They both mean essentially the same thing, that is the percent dissolved solids. And because we do it with a hydrometer, just the same way you measure a battery, the acid in a battery. And since the dissolved solids other than sugar amounts to perhaps 0.5% or less, maybe 1/4%, that's calcium, sodium, chloride, all the salts, so on. That if you dried it out and weighed it, you'd find that most of it was sugar. So that for all intents and purposes, degree Brix or degree Bowling means the percent sugar. But if you want to get down to nitpicking, it isn't exactly that. There's a slight amount of that solids which is not sugar. So most of this then from now on will be, in the new text, will be referred to as degree Brix. Now, this is the overcrop situation, and I said this is degree Bowling, and maybe this is the percent acid that you would like to have for a nice Bowling or Brix, now Brix acid ratio. Now some of you, as evidenced by your questions after class, even though we went over it 2 or 3 times in class, didn't seem to get what I meant when I said we like, for table fruit, for example, a ratio of 25 to 1. You kept talking about, gee, 1% acid and 25% sugar would be ridiculous. I said a ratio, which for table fruit of Thompson seedless, for example, which we would like to have for ideal eating, would be 20 degrees Brix over 0.8% acid. And if you divide 0.8 into this, you'll get 25. And it's 25 then to 25 to 1. That's what I was trying to get across, but some of you didn't seem to get that idea. You kept saying 25% sugar, why Thompsons would be raisins, and they would. This is what we like for ideal eating quality, but we're not going to go into this because that's a 105 1-hour lecture. All I was trying to give you is an example. The higher the ratio goes, it's always the best, as I gave you in that example of the fertilizer experiment. Because if you get this very high, you've overcropped and brought them way out here and kept them on until you can get 40-to-1 ratio. If you come way out here and get the bricks at this point and the acid at this point, you see the acid continues to go down, and if you have to leave them on longer and longer and longer to get your normal sugar, you can get a very high ratio, but that isn't what you want for good quality. Now, why does this overcrop situation finally get up to getting the normal sugar? Well, of course, part of it is that there is a gradual increase in sugar, even though the vines are chugging up the hill trying to carry this load. But part of this increase in sugar in these last few days, let's face it, under California conditions, is not an increase in sugar, but a decrease in water. Because in many of our California vineyards in the late fall, or practically all of our California vineyards in late fall, are in a water stress condition. So you get a little bit of shriveling, a very slight amount of shriveling, which, when you press the juice out, gives you a higher percentage sugar. If you take a 10% sugar solution and evaporate half the water, you got a 20% sugar solution. So it's a little bit of that effect there. Okay, the whole point of this principle we're talking about was the overcropping effect, and normally in the past we've gone ahead and given all these minor principles of pruning and then gone on into the point of this overcropping. But thinking about it some over the night and so forth, I thought, well, the logical thing is to give you the overcropping sermon now and then go into the minor principles of pruning. So we'll start with that. And can you catch them if I throw them? They're all glass. Okay, so we have the first slide. Now this is a summary of a publication by Dr. Winkler, and a very good one on this whole idea of overcropping. And in the past I have required it as it has been required reading, because we gave out copies when the classes were 25 or 30 and we had plenty of copies. Then for a year or two we put it on reserve and made it required reading. But I think I can give you the essentials out of it without you having to go read it as a requirement. But some of you who majors in the department and so forth may want to look it up and read it in more detail. But I think I can cover, as I say, the essential ingredients out of it. This is by Winkler, and it's in the American Journal of Enology. Fairly old. It's my God, I've got the copy of it, but it didn't give the reference. I thought all of these things out of the... All right, I'll have to give you the reference next time. I'll get the... it's out of the American Journal of Enology, but for some reason they don't give the... Oh, here it is. Okay. I wrote it on here last time. Volume 5, page 4 to 12, 1954. 20 years ago. But the lesson is still there. 1954, if you want to read the details of this. But all of the graphs are on these slides I'm going to show you, and I'll try to cover the main points of it. Okay, let's have the first slide. And the lights, please, they're behind you. Now, see, this only goes through 1950, 51, 52, 53. But one of the things which, if you read something about the history of California grape production, comes out of it, is that way back about in the Depression, 1934, 1935, we only produced about 2 million tons. Now this is, on the next slide, to show the actual ups and downs. This just evens it out for a simplicity of explanation here. But back in those years, we produced somewhere around in 35, 36 or so. Who's the solid block back there? Okay. Back in here, we produced a little over 2 million tons. Up to around 1954, we're up to just short of 3 million tons. And any of those, if you've been following the recent yields for the past few years, we're averaging more like 3.5 million tons. A year or two, we've almost touched 4 million tons. So the curve continues to go up off the scale. The acreage, see the acreage starting out here at something under 500,000 over this period stayed more or less constant. But of course this past year we've gone up, as you know from last week's handout, up to around 600,000 acres. But looking at this period here with the acreage staying the same and the yields going up, you ask yourself, well, gee, what's happened? And it'd be nice if the viticulture department could say, well, it's because of all of our wonderful research work and teaching and ways to prune and ways to fertilize and all this. But it hasn't been entirely that. Much of this increase in crop started during World War II, in which we had as all of you were born after that, but in World War II, as in World War I, one of the first shortages we had was in sugar. And anything then that produced sugar, whether it was grapes or dates, which I happened to be working with at the time, became a very high-priced commodity. And during World War II, you could sell, as Winkler likes to say, you could sell anything that was wrapped up in a grape skin. No matter what the quality was, it could be a dry husk. It was wrapped up in a grape skin. So people learned that they could put on high crops and get high yields or high income from it and not worry about quality. So that gave them the idea. It's like letting a kid find out he can get away with something. So they could get away with it. And then after World War II ended, we went on this inflation binge in which a grower had to maintain those high crops or he couldn't make a living. So he went to higher and higher. He kept putting on these high crops that he learned he could get away with back here, even though they were low quality and overcrop condition. He continued to do that. And as you know, inflation has continued that way. So a grower has to continually fight the battle of increased crop and don't worry about quality. Now, he doesn't have to worry about quality of either raisins or wine, so long as the raisin producers will buy it and the wineries will buy his grapes, one or the other. And that's going to be the end of my sermon, so I'll give you the end right now and then give it to you again later. That if the wineries would lower the axe on the growers, and if the raisin producers would lower the axe on them, the growers would improve the quality of their grapes by lowering their crop. But a grower is stupid to cut his crop down to get quality unless he's paid for it. So don't blame the growers because we have reduced quality of raisins or reduced quality of wine grapes. It's the wineries and the producers who have got to tighten up, get together, join hands, united we stand, divided we fall idea, and get and put a quality standard on grapes. But that's going to be the final summary, not now. Anyway, this is the way things have gone generally. Well, let's look at the next and see how it's gone in detail. Now here is more of a detail over that same period. That Winkler just evened this curve out like this. But this shows you the ups and downs of the production year by year by year. And you see here we were down to 1.5 million, then up to 2.5, and then back down to 1.5 million, and up to 2.5 million, and back and forth, up and down on terms of production. And much of this has been due to overcropping, because although Winkler used to say that you get a high crop one year and it dropped the next year because of overcropping, some of the work that Olmo's been doing, incidentally with regard to mechanical harvesting and the effect of knocking off a lot of leaves at harvest time and all this business, has shown that frequently a vineyard in good condition can stand 2 years of abuse before it rebels. And then you go back and look at this and you see that. You see here's a high year and there's a high year before it dropped. Then you get a high one and a low one, up and down. But frequently you'll get here having to get 3 high years before the vines finally drop down. Here we got a couple of high years, and then they showed the effect of taking this capacity of the vine, dividing it between crop and wood. You can get away with it sometimes for a couple of years, but then you're going to pay for it finally by getting a low crop. Now, just for the sake of illustration on this particular chart, this particular low year at this point was caused by one of the worst frosts we've had. So that wiped out the crop that particular year, according to Winkler. He can't tell me, he doesn't remember, doesn't recall why this was a low year immediately after this. And then over here, although it was 2 high years and then a drop, part of this was due to frost. But in general, these ups and downs are due to much of the ups and downs from year to year due to overcropping. And this, of course, is based primarily on Thompson seedless, the one that makes up, in those days, certainly well over half of our tonnage. Say in those days, probably 60% of the tonnage. Okay, let's see the next slide. And this was one fairly recent that I got, well, recent compared to the 54, which you just saw. And this at least brings it up to 62, but that's still 10 years old. But it's the latest I could get my hands on. This is California's gross wine production and inventories. And this is production here, up and down, up and down, up and down, and so forth down the line. And here's consumption, which, as all of you know, has been on a gradual increase and still continues for the next 10 years on a continuing, perhaps increasing slope on consumption. But this is inventories here, and this gives your inventories over the year.
Why did it drop in 47?
That's the next interesting point I'm going to talk to you about. Yeah, here is he asked, here's the consumption. I don't know why the consumption dropped in 47, but I'll shortly tell you why the production was so high in 46 and then dropped down so low in 47. Look, remember though, as an introduction of that, look at the inventories here in 43 and 44.
How come you say California? Because it seems that all the producers had a good year that year.
What year?
Or a bad year.
Well, the whole state, but
right.
But some.
If it were overcropping, wouldn't it be too much of a coincidence that everybody would overcrop?
Well, no, but there's enough overcropping to carry the vote, enough of an overcropping effect in one year where you get a big-headed crop. For example, this past year, 1973, we had a fantastically large crop. Now, we're all looking forward to see whether or not we're going to have a big crop in 74, or whether that high crop is going to cause this terrific depression in the next year's crop, because conditions are such that I had a large crop. But at this moment, it looks like we're going to have another high crop in 74 unless we have a terrific frost. Because one of the things which seems to influence high crops in the following year is good, adequate, sufficient, and early winter rains. And we've had them this year. So everything at this moment is shaping up to another high year for crop. And as all of us in the department have said repeatedly for the past 5 years, that the first time that we get 2 bumper high crops back to back in successive years, we're going to see a whole change in the wine market. As some of you may know, at the end of 1973 season, with over 2 million tons crushed, every barrel in the state is full of wine. Every reservoir, every barrel in the state is full of wine. Now, if we have another year like that next year, either you guys are going to have to rev up the wine consumption, or there's going to be a little bit of a market problem on wine. Okay, so did that essentially answer? Okay, now here then has been the situation. Now somebody asked, why was the consumption so low here? I don't know why. I think probably it's a price matter, to answer your question. Because the other thing you don't know, I said that during World War II, we had a sugar shortage. And we had an edict that you couldn't make wine during those years out of Thompson seedless. You had to sell them as fresh, or you had to sell them as raisins. Now there were certain, that's a sort of a sweeping statement, but in general there were restrictions that really cut down on wine, on the use of sugar grapes to make wine during World War II. We needed the raisins and as a sugar source. So that the stocks or the inventories of wine dropped off greatly back here in 41, 42, 43, the inventories of wine that were being held for aging, so we dropped down to a low level. All of a sudden, the war ended. The restriction was off, and the wine production went boom, the highest you see of all this period. There's more grapes made into wine at the end of 46 than in any of this period that we're looking at in a 20-year period. Now, to give you an idea what that did to the prices, that's when some people paid off the mortgage, because in 1945, back in 1945, before the restriction went off, the growers got an average of $57 a ton. $57 a ton. In 1946, when the controls went off, the price jumped to $91 a ton. From $57 in 45 to $91 a ton the next year. And then in 1947, it only dropped to $30 a ton. How can you stay in a business that jumps around like that? From 57 and 45 to $91, that's a statewide average for crushed grapes, $91 in 46, and then back to $30 in 47. $30 in 47. Because they crushed and filled everything they could find to fill and paint, and they went sort of panicky, you know. Here, all of a sudden, the controls were off. They could crush all they wanted to. They bought terrific amounts of grapes and made a lot of wine. And the price on the, well, we'll show that on the next slide. But that gives you an idea. I just want to review that in 1945, $57 a ton, 46 an average of 91, and in 47 it dropped down to $30 a ton. A third of what they got the year before. Talk about the stock market. This is really some roller coaster stock market. Okay, and that's part of what I'm trying to get across. This up and down of crop levels brought about by having the grapes carrying their absolute maximum load of fruit year after year causes these ups and downs with the slightest changes in climate or season or effects of this type. Okay, the next slide. And I said I'm talking about the stock market deal. Well, this isn't the one I wanted to show. Show the next one and save that one, will you? Well, all right, we'll show this one. Okay, this shows you what happens to the grape deal. And remember that the whole picture of California industry, I keep forgetting we got people over here can't see through my back. The whole picture of California industry I'm talking about is swayed or controlled by the Thompson seedless. And this shows you what happens. See, here's the table fruit consumption, and it just stays more or less like you might expect things to do, a little ups and downs. But look how the crush up here compares to the raisins. You see, over the years, the raisin industry and the Thompson seedless, they put it this way, that the grower has been a little bit in the driver's seat because he could wait up till the middle of August to decide whether he's going to send his grapes to the winery or make raisins out of it. And he has to decide in that about the 15th or 20th of August which way he's going. And he goes depending upon the market. And you see, and this is just a reflection of it, that if they go to the winery, as he did here in 46 at $90 a ton, then there's not very many made into raisins. But in 47, when the winery price went to $30, the raisins go up. And you have this almost mirror image here between one going up and one going down. Obviously, if you've got Thompson seedless and you put them into wine, then the raisins go down. If you put them into raisins, the winery goes down. So you see the way that this thing has been fought over the years. And it's still being fought. Even though right today, the raisins have gone to something like $600 a ton, which converted backwards figures out to about $100 to $150 a fresh ton, and you're putting that against the winery demand for Thompsons for wine. So it's still, Thompsons are still that two-way, or in this case, three-way grape, table, raisin, and wine grape. But in the industry, of course, you've already decided whether you're going to go table and set your trellis up, done all your thinning and training that way. So it really becomes a two-way grape here, whether it's going to go raisin or wine. But you can see something of what this does to the market. Okay, let's see the next slide. And this shows what it does to the price. Here in 1946, when they were getting $90 a ton for the grapes, they got up to about $1.25 a bulk gallon price. The next year when grapes, you can see why they only paid $30 a ton the next year, because by the next year they were down to about 45 cents a gallon. See, here's the supply. They didn't have much of a supply here in 46, but when the supply went way up, the price went down, obviously. And here the price of wine then had this great big boom period in that 1 year of 46. And then it stayed in the doldrums here until we came over and it began to pick up over here because of low crops. This is low supply. So, as I said before, if you're talking about playing the stock market, there's no more roller coaster game than the wine and raisin industry in California with this business of erratic crops up and down. And they're not so erratic as you might get in some other countries, but you still get this effect of the fact that we're right at the having the vineyards produce the maximum amount they can, even going to the point of edge of overcropping. And with the reduced quality that you get with overcropping, you can get some of these effects on prices. Okay, next slide, or is there one more? Now, I said that that overcropping caused a delay in maturity, and this is a slide to illustrate this. This is some work by Dr. Winkler in which he tried in several varieties over several years to measure this effect on delay in maturity. Now, let's just pick Muscat here. And here's where he had the yields per acre were 5, 7, and 11 tons. Well, let's go to this one. It's nicer, 6, 9, and 12. 6, 9, and 12 tons per acre. And these were the ones that he had cropped at 6 tons per acre. He picked September the 11th and got his 20-degree barreling with a .58. I'll discuss this in a moment. And then where he had 9 tons, he increased the crop by 50%, but he had to wait 19 days more in order to pick them. And at that time, they were 21. Or if he went to 12 tons, he waited over a month later in order to pick them at the same barreling degree. But while he was doing this, the acid was dropping, 58, 52, 46. And we have set up quality standards on most of these varieties to give you this barreling acid ratio we're talking about. And if you go to the tables and look up these grades that are associated with these, you'll find that 20 over 58 gives you a grade 2. 21 over 52 gives you a grade 4, and 20.2 over 46 gives you grade 6, which is, according to the scale that's set up, is useful only for distilling material. That gets back to that example I gave you about the fertilizer experiment. So he got 12 tons, but it was only useful for distilling material. Whereas if he stayed at 6 tons, he got a very nice quality grape on Muscat. Well, let's go to Zinfandel. You don't worry about Muscat or Mission. This class only interested in wine. Okay, let's go here to Zinfandel in 52. Let's go to this one. That's 5 times 10, and 5 is too low, and 10 may be too high. But here's a 6, 8, and 10-ton crop. They picked a 6-ton crop on September the 9th with a 21.5 barreling, or bricks. I've got to learn to say bricks. 21.5 bricks. And a very nice acid to give you a very nice wine quality. But in that same vineyard, if you leave 10 tons on, you can pick them over a month later in order to get the same sugar over a month later. But in that month, the acid has dropped way down from 1.13 down to 0.7, which, taking the BA ratio, gives you a grade 4, which is a pretty low-quality wine. Now, if you grow a low-quality wine, you can get two things. You can get a terrific amount of wine, which in the past years led to a surplus, and a low-quality wine. Now, how fast is that going to move on the market? When the market knows that you've got a surplus, and they also know that it's not very good quality. Why not produce something intermediate, perhaps something like this? See, this 8 ton still gave them a grade 1 grape. Reduce the total amount, which does away with the surplus, and improve the quality, which ought to improve the market. Now, that simple little fact seems to be pretty hard to get through to the grape growers of this state. And why, I don't know. That's all the slides, isn't it? Oh, no. Okay, here's one more thing I want to point out. See, I'm talking about quality of wine with those grades, and it's whether you're talking about wine grapes or table grapes, because here's table grapes. A few of you might be interested in eating them fresh. Here's the effective level of crop on the color development and our two most important table grapes, Tokay and Emperor. And you've got to have, for U.S. Fancy grade, you have got to have 60% color in Tokay, or 75% color in Emperor to have them graded U.S. Fancy. So with a light crop, there's no problem here, of course. I don't know why we don't have the data there, but this is well over the 60. With a normal crop, we made it here on Tokay, and we made it with Emperor. But you go to a medium-heavy crop, and immediately between normal and medium-heavy, and here's the number of clusters. Some of you are going to say what's heavy and what's medium. Here's the number of clusters per vine. In the Monday afternoon bull session, I was telling you about how the Thompson seedless grown for table fruit, when we prune them to 4 canes, which is roughly 60 buds, we'll still wind up with something like 60 to 80 clusters. But we take them all off except 20 to 25 clusters, 20 to 24, I said in the class. And I pointed out that the amount of fruit that we cut off the vines in thinning table fruit is far more than the average crop production of the world. Yes, sure.
I have a question on the clusters of vine. Both light and normal Emperors have the same number of clusters.
Yeah, I don't understand that. That's one I hadn't seen either. I don't know why they have that, but this is the data that came out of the work. This must be an error. You've got a good point. I'll check on that and see what I can find out. But why we have 25 and 25 is light and normal, I don't know. Except perhaps one of the things that I've told you, that Emperor tends to be light bearing. You have to leave longer spurs, 3-bud spurs, so on, as we'll get into more detail a little bit later in the next lecture. So it may be that they just couldn't find anything that they call it, but they should have left one of these blank then, if they only could get 20. I don't understand that at all. That's a good point. Okay, but then we go here, and the point that I was talking about, on the Thompson seedless grown for table fruit with 4 canes, the way you pruned in the last lab, you're going to get something like 60 to 80 clusters. And even though you prune them down to 4 canes and you thought that was pretty severe pruning, you're still going to take off 2/3 of the crop that comes out in order to get down to get good quality. And that's true on Tokay and Emperor. You're still going to thin them quite heavily, even though they're spur pruned. You'll still go in Tokay at least and thin it. Now Emperor you don't do much thinning on because they don't set that many clusters. But so you might do a little bit. But on Tokay you will do some thinning and take off some of the clusters, even though you spur prune them. But this gives you effect then of the crop load. Looking only at Tokay, since it's pointed out that this one seems to be found up. Looking at Tokay, as you go up in crop, you go down in quality. Considering color only, and of course sugar would be related to that coloring also. And we'll give you more details on this type of thing later on when we're discussing thinning and its effect on quality. Right now we're just talking about this general principle of overcropping. Okay, that's the last slide, isn't it? Okay, may I have the lights, please? Okay, so let's summarize this whole thing then, effective overcropping, by putting it as the effect on the vine first. The effect on the vine, as you might expect, is going to be, since capacity equals and I told you you'd see this about 15 times, and this will be about the 4th time, since capacity equals fruit plus wood growth. And if you're going to go to a heavy crop, then the effect of overcropping is to cause a poor development, poor wood growth for next year's crop. It's going to be short. In general, it's going to be short growth and poorly matured. And this means then that you may have low fruitfulness of buds or susceptibility to winter injury from cold. And those of you out in lab can look at the dead wood that shows out there now in the pruning lab. You can see how most of those canes have died back anywhere from 6 inches to 2 feet, depending on whether or not they were weak growth or perhaps overcropped, so that you do not get the good wood maturity. You do not get the buildup of carbohydrate into the wood to give the, what I refer to often as the antifreeze. In a way, even though some of my examples I give you perhaps may seem ridiculous, the basic idea is still there, that as the grapevine accumulates its carbohydrate with a moderate crop, so that you do have some carbohydrate going into the wood to mature the wood, as we call it. Mature the wood means to build up carbohydrates in it. In a way, this acts as an antifreeze, because we'll get around discussing later that in cold weather, not because, I don't know why, it isn't because the plant knows it ought to, but in cold weather, you get a conversion in this wood tissue of some of the starch into sugar. And the example, of course, you can give is if you store potatoes in a very cold temperature, you can get, they'll turn sweet on you because some of the starch turns to sugar. This enzyme reaction takes place there. Well, if you want to look at it this way, then, if you have good, well-matured wood, perhaps some of the sugar starch changes to sugar and builds up the sugar solution in the cells and acts just as though you'd put antifreeze in your radiator. Now, that's a very simplified version of what goes on, but this is the net result. That if you've got if you've got surplus of carbohydrate material from not overcropping, then it builds up into this, it's stored into the wood, gives you what we refer to as mature wood, and then this gives you good resistance to damage by low temperatures, which we had some in the last month. So, overcropping affects the amount of growth that you get and the degree of maturity of that wood and the degree of fruitfulness of that wood. The amount of growth, the degree of maturity, and associated with it, the degree of fruitfulness. Okay, what does it have then on the crop itself? You just saw the effect here on table fruit. It affects the color of the fruit, the size of the berries, and the nature, let's say, nature of maturity of the fruit, the nature of the maturity fruit. You can get small berries, you can get a low sugar. If you pick them on time, if you pick them late, there could be a very bad Bowling acid ratio. So that this effect then comes in with that. And then what I should have brought in then with a vine, but you can call it here, along with overcropping, you get an alternate bearing effect, in which you get high crops for 1 or 2 years, and then you can get a low crop to pay off, to make up the difference. Now, I might as well finish this sermon. It isn't much of a sermon now because of the situation that exists in which wineries are screaming for grapes. But perhaps that in itself is a lesson, because up until beginning about 10 years ago and lasting until about 5 years ago, the wineries finally began to get a little bit tough on growers and began to, well, they didn't get so tough at first, because what they did, they didn't tell them to take their grapes back and feed them to the hogs, but they did decide to give them a bonus, a little extra bonus for having grapes of the higher the sugar, so they'd get maybe a $2.50, $5 a ton bonus. And if they were below a certain given level, they decide on, say, 22-degree Bowling. If they were below that, they would penalize them $2.50 or $5. Well, a grower isn't going to worry much about that if he can make 10 tons instead of 6, and it only penalizes him $5 a ton. He isn't going to worry about that. One of the conversations I had one time with a grower, and this was about 15 years ago, when raisins, believe it or not, were down to less than $200 a ton. And he was a very progressive grower, and he knew everything that was going on and so forth. And he said, sure. He said, I can grow you high-quality raisins at 2 tons per acre, or I can grow raisins and make 3 tons per acre and sell them. And he said, what the deal is that I'm getting $180 a ton for 3 tons per acre. Now he says if I want to really increase the quality, he says I have to drop them down to about 2 tons or 2.5 tons. He was saying 2.5, but just to illustrate this thing real good, let's say 2 tons per acre. But he says I get a $10 bonus for the extra quality. So he says, shall I grow 2 tons at $190 per ton for 2 tons per acre? Or shall I grow 3 tons at $180 a ton? Well, even a moron can figure out where he's going to make his money. But suppose the raisin processor says, I won't buy these. Now, where's that put him? And so that's what the raisin processor ought to do, number 1 step. But number 2 step, he ought to make this about $250 and say, I won't buy those. Now, they were beginning to get to this point where they were beginning to get a little courage to put some teeth into quality controls until we suddenly went into this wine boom. And then when you get to a wine boom and you can sell anything you put in a bottle. Now, Winkler said during the World War II you could sell anything that's wrapped in a grape skin. Today you can sell anything that's wrapped in a wine bottle. So, until we get over this great big shortage of wine, once again, the wineries are a little afraid to put teeth into this quality control. But somebody said in the Monday section that some of the wineries are beginning right now to put some teeth back into it, and they're doing it pretty good. They're making differences of $20 or $30 a ton, 10% difference or so. So you can watch it in the next few years. We're going to get around once again to paying for quality, which means you'll have to crop to a normal level. Okay.